A wealthy CEO in the heart of Manhattan, a poor street artist, struggling to survive, fighting over the last cookie. No one could have guessed that this odd, almost comical encounter would lead to a love story filled with pain, healing, and a quiet kind of magic. This is not a fairy tale. It is the journey of two people from opposite worlds, finding each other through prejudice, pressure, and the unexpected honesty of the heart. The ballroom shimmered beneath a canopy of crystal chandeliers, each casting scattered halos of light across velvet gowns and tailored tuxedos. Waiters glided like shadows through the crowd, balancing silver trays lined with champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. The hum of polite conversation rose and fell in waves, punctuated by occasional laughter or the sharp strike of a gavel on the auctioneer's podium. Julian Hayes stood at the center of it all, the way a flame draws every eye in a dark room. His presence had that quiet kind of dominance, polished, practiced, and precise. Dressed in a midnight blue suit, he exchanged pleasantries with art dealers and hedge fund moguls, never missing a beat. He smiled the way successful men do, as if he had already read the last page of everyone else's story and found it predictably dull. At the far end of the room near the dessert table, Chloe Evans looked thoroughly out of place. Her black boots had scuff marks on the toes, and the hem of her coat was still wet from the slush she had trudged through to get there. The invitation, sent by some over-enthusiastic art student intern, had promised exposure and opportunity, two words she had grown to resent. Still, free food was free food, and she was starving. She reached for the last cookie, a ridiculous little thing with gold leaf on top and some kind of raspberry reduction, and at the exact moment her fingers brushed the edge of the silver plate, a perfectly manicured hand reached for it too. Julian looked down, amused, his fingers freezing midair. Chloe looked up, unimpressed, her eyes sharp beneath the brim of her knit beanie. "You go ahead," he said, that smooth, infuriating kind of polite. "I got here first," she replied without smiling, already picking it up. He arched an eyebrow. "Did you? Unless you have a better argument than I'm rich and I hover attractively near food, then yes, I did." Julian chuckled, though it sounded more like a scoff. "Interesting strategy. You insult people and take their dessert. You can afford to lose a cookie, or is that what this whole night is about? Watching you bid absurd amounts of money on things you'll never use." The conversation had grown quiet around them, but Julian was used to people watching. Chloe was not, yet she did not flinch. "I suppose we all do what we can to survive," he said coolly, his tone teetering between curiosity and contempt. She took a bite of the cookie, slow and deliberate, as if it were a statement. "And some of us still manage to have taste while we do it," she muttered before turning away, not sparing him a second glance. Julian stood still for a moment, lips pressed into a bemused line. He had been challenged, and not by a board member or rival CEO, by a stranger with paint on her hands and a chip on her shoulder. He did not know her name, not yet, but he knew the look in her eyes, the kind that refused to bow. He had built empires and outmaneuvered titans, but that night, under the soft gleam of chandeliers and champagne bubbles, it was the cookie thief in combat boots who left the sharper impression. Julian watched her walk away, a curl of disdain tugging at the corner of his mouth. The cookie, now half-eaten, had been claimed, and so had the moment. For the first time in a long while, he felt something other than routine politeness or strategic calculation. It was irritation, yes, but sharpened by something else. Curiosity, maybe, or confusion. She had challenged him so quickly, so unapologetically, as if she had seen straight through the immaculate surface and found it unimpressive. He returned to the crowd, where conversations about mergers and museum acquisitions floated like background music. A collector beside him asked about the new digital gallery Julian's firm had funded downtown. But Julian's answers came slower than usual. He kept thinking about that girl, the firm way she had looked at him, the way she had taken that cookie like it belonged to her, not just in a physical sense, but with an almost defiant confidence, as if denying him something was a necessary act of principle. Meanwhile, Chloe slipped through a side corridor near the catering entrance, her fingers still sticky with raspberry. She wiped them absently on a cocktail napkin, avoiding the eyes of passing guests. She should not have said anything, should have just grabbed the cookie and walked away. But something in his voice, so effortless, so amused, had made her spine tighten. The kind of voice that never had to fight for attention, never had to worry about being heard. She found a quiet alcove near the coat room and took a moment to breathe. Overhead, a chandelier swayed ever so slightly in the draft. She glanced around at the velvet-lined walls, the champagne flutes with gold rims, the attendees who looked like they had been plucked from the cover of an old-fashioned magazine. This world was not hers, not even for one night. Still, the man's face stayed in her mind. Calm, polished, absurdly symmetrical, like someone grown in a luxury lab. She scoffed under her breath. The perfect image of someone who had never waited tables, never shared a heater with 3 roommates, never bartered sketches for subway rides. Julian, on the other hand, could not help but ask around. Casually, of course. A question to a passing assistant about who had coordinated the visual displays. A glance at the guest list for any unfamiliar names. No one seemed to know her. It annoyed him. Not knowing. Not understanding why someone like her, brash, underdressed, and clearly unimpressed, had found her way into this space and into his thoughts. They both left the event that night with a trace of discomfort. Not because of what had happened, but because of what it had stirred. Something small and intangible, like the faint bitterness left on the tongue after something too sweet. Neither of them knew they would meet again soon, and neither would have believed it if someone had told them that the next time it would not be over dessert, but over paint, silence, and something far more difficult to swallow than pride. 3 mornings later, Julian stepped barefoot into the garden behind the townhouse, a mug of black coffee in one hand, the other tugging absently at the collar of his dress shirt. He had a conference call in 30 minutes and needed a breath of air before the blur of negotiations and investor jargon consumed the day. The family garden was usually quiet at that hour, manicured hedges, stone paths, and the faint hum of bees hovering over rosemary bushes. It was one of the few spaces in his world that felt unbothered by ambition. But this morning something was different. Color. That was the first thing he noticed. Vivid streaks of turquoise and orange slashing across the once blank wall at the far end of the garden. Then came the music, low and rhythmic, pouring from a small speaker near a stepladder. And finally, the figure balanced halfway up it, holding a can of spray paint in one gloved hand and pulling her sleeve up with the other. Julian froze. She turned slightly, sensing him before she even looked. Their eyes met, and she groaned. Not dramatically, not loudly, but the sound escaped her like a sigh she had tried to swallow and failed. "Oh, she muttered, lowering the spray can. "You again." Julian blinked. "What the hell are you doing here?" Chloe climbed down the ladder without haste, peeling off her glove. "That's charming. No good morning? No welcome to my backyard?" "I was under the impression this was a private property," he said, taking a step forward. "You know, for family and plants." Chloe crossed her arms, tilting her head toward the mural behind her. "Apparently your sister disagrees. She reached out last week, commissioned me to do a piece, said she wanted something that felt alive." Julian pinched the bridge of his nose. Of course, his sister, eccentric, brilliant, and impulsively generous, was the type to treat family rules as mere suggestions. "Did she tell you who lived here?" he asked, voice flat. "She mentioned a brother," Chloe said with mock innocence. "She did not say he was a tyrant with cookie-related trauma." A beat of silence passed between them, broken only by the faint hiss of morning traffic beyond the garden wall. "I do not think this is a good idea," Julian muttered half to himself, but Chloe caught it. "I did not come here for your approval," she said, turning back to her paints. "I am here for the wall. You can either ignore me or watch quietly while I work." Julian lingered for a few seconds longer, as if searching for a reason to tell her to leave. But then she raised the spray can again, fluid and confident, and something about the way the colors bloomed against the concrete stopped him. He took a sip of his coffee. Bitter, like that moment 3 nights ago. Like her voice when she looked at him as though she had already made up her mind. Chloe, focused now, resumed her strokes without glancing his way again. Julian turned and walked back inside, but he did not go far. Instead, he stood just behind the glass doors, watching through the reflection, telling himself it was the noise that bothered him. Or the paint fumes. Certainly not the way the sun caught in her hair, or the way the garden no longer felt predictable. By the end of the week, the wall had transformed into a riot of color, ribbons of flame and water interlacing with silhouetted figures dancing beneath an open sky. It was bold, alive, unapologetic. Much like the artist herself, Julian thought grimly, watching her from the study window on the second floor. Chloe came every morning just after 8 o'clock. She carried a battered satchel filled with brushes, gloves, and paint cans that clinked softly as she walked. She played music while she worked, never loud but enough to irritate him because it made the garden feel like hers, as if the space he once escaped to had been hijacked by someone who did not ask permission and would not care even if she had. He began taking his coffee on the terrace at the same hour she arrived, claiming it was routine. Chloe never acknowledged him first. She would nod vaguely if their eyes met, then turn away as if his presence barely registered. And yet something about her silence was deliberate, calculated even. Julian, who was rarely ignored, found it intolerable. "Must be exhausting," he said one morning, not bothering to hide the sarcasm. "Making a living from defacing perfectly clean walls." She looked up from the mural, not missing a beat. "Must be exhausting pretending you understand art." He almost laughed, though the sound stayed caught in his throat. She was quick, always. Her replies were not cruel, just sharp enough to remind him that she did not care who he was. That perhaps was the part that unsettled him most. That afternoon, he walked through the garden with a phone pressed to his ear, pretending to review business projections while keeping half an eye on her progress. Chloe barely looked at him, but her tone shifted subtly when she said, more to the wall than to him, "You know, you could just say it." "Say what?" "That you hate it, the mural, the mess, me." Julian paused. The leaves rustled softly overhead, casting shifting shadows over her hands and the half-finished image blooming behind her. "I do not hate it," he said after a moment, surprising himself with the honesty in his voice. "I hate not understanding what it means." Chloe turned, eyes narrowing slightly. "Why do you have to understand it? Why not just feel it?" He did not answer. Could not, really. It was not how he had been taught to operate. Feelings were inefficient. Feelings clouded judgment. But still, he stood there long after his call had ended, pretending to be occupied while watching the way her fingers guided color across stone, like it belonged there. Later inside, his sister smirked knowingly over dinner. "She is good," she said, chewing on a piece of bread. "And she gets under your skin. That is a rare combination." Julian frowned at his wine glass. "She is reckless and rude." "And real," his sister replied, shrugging. "You could use a little of that." Outside, Chloe continued painting beneath the glow of a hanging garden light, alone but never unnoticed. The garden had become a battleground, not of words but of wills. Every glance, every pause, every unanswered question hovering between them like smoke in still air. Neither of them would retreat first. Neither of them would admit it, but the proximity, forced and begrudging, was changing the way they saw everything, including each other. By the third week, something began to shift, barely perceptible at first, like the faint change in air before rain. The mural was nearing completion. Chloe spent longer hours in the garden, working through midday, sleeves rolled up, paint streaked across her forearms like battle marks. She sang under her breath when she forgot he was near, and sometimes danced a little to the music that played from her speaker. Not for performance, just because the rhythm asked for it. Julian watched more than he meant to. At first, it was because the mural felt intrusive, a burst of rebellion against the order he had always curated so precisely. But soon he began to study the way her hand moved before it touched the wall. The brief pause, the narrowing of her eyes as though she were translating something only she could see. He noticed how meticulous she was, how nothing was left unfinished or random. Her art, he realized, was not chaos. It was controlled fire. One afternoon, he stepped outside with the quiet intention of asking her something, though the question itself had not yet formed. She was crouched on the stone path, mixing two shades of blue. The sun struck the side of her face, catching flecks of dried paint on her cheekbone. He stopped a few feet away. "How do you decide where to begin?" he asked, the words sounding more personal than he had intended. Chloe looked up, squinting slightly. "With what?" "With something this big." She sat back on her heels, considering. "I find the place that feels empty," she said, "the part that resists, and then I press on it until it opens." Julian nodded, not entirely understanding, but somehow feeling the answer anyway. He stayed a moment longer before turning away, but her voice followed him. "You do that too, you know." He turned. "Do what?" "Press on things, people, spaces. Looking for weakness, I guess." He did not reply. Instead, he left the garden with a strange weight in his chest, unsure if it was admiration or discomfort. That night, Chloe caught a glimpse of him standing by the library window, still dressed in a dark suit, tie loosened, his posture rigid, but his eyes distant. The lights were off behind him. He was not reading, not moving, just staring out at nothing in particular. There were moments like that, moments she saw past the tailored lines and precise hair to something tired, not broken, but weathered, like a ship too long at sea, gleaming on the surface but salt-worn beneath. She began to wonder what a man like Julian Hayes did when no one was watching, what he feared, what he wanted, when he was not pretending not to want anything. One evening, when rain scattered across the slate tiles and she was cleaning her brushes in the corner of the garden, he brought her a cup of tea. He did not say anything, just placed it near her satchel and walked away. Chloe stared at the steam rising from the porcelain. She did not thank him. But the next day she brought an extra pair of gloves and left them folded neatly beside the garden bench where he sometimes sat. Neither mentioned it, but the air between them had shifted again. Less like a battlefield now, more like a field where something fragile had begun to grow. Something unnamed but not unnoticed. The afternoons grew quieter as summer folded into the edge of autumn. The light slanted differently now, softer, golden, casting long shadows across the stone paths of the garden. The mural, nearly complete, no longer demanded Chloe's full concentration. She worked in smaller, slower motions, lingering over details she had once rushed. Her music still played, but more often than not, she would pause it when Julian joined her, and silence would fill the space instead. Comfortable, steady, like the pause between words that do not need to be spoken. One such afternoon, Julian sat on the bench with his sleeves rolled up, the knot of his tie undone, and tucked into his shirt pocket like a forgotten obligation. Chloe was perched on the ladder, shading the curve of a wing in her mural. A phoenix, he now realized, emerging from flame and smoke. He had not asked, but he understood it now. "You always paint bird," he said, not accusing, just observing. Chloe glanced down at him. "I like them." "Because they can fly away?" She smiled without turning. "No, because they always come back." Julian nodded, thoughtful. A few moments passed, marked only by the faint rustle of the wind and the rhythm of her brush. "Why murals?" he asked after a while. "You could do galleries, sell your work. Comfort, recognition, even control." "I do not want to be boxed in," she replied simply. "Walls talk back. Canvas is safe. Too safe. Besides, I do not paint for collectors." "Then for who?" Chloe paused, her brush frozen in midair. "For the kids who walk past this wall every day and think their voices do not matter. For the woman who takes the night shift and needs color in her life. For myself, on the days when I forget why I started." Julian stared at her, his expression unreadable. But beneath it, something stirred. "I envy that," he murmured, "knowing why you started." Chloe descended the ladder, wiping her hands on a rag. "You do not?" He gave a dry laugh, low and without joy. "I started because I was good at winning, and people liked when I won. And now?" Julian leaned back, looking up at the streak of orange clouds above them. "Now I spend more time protecting what I've built than enjoying it. Every room I walk into has expectations nailed to the walls. I do not remember the last time I made a decision that was mine alone." Chloe sat on the edge of the stone planter, a small distance from him, but not out of reach. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," he said quietly, surprising himself again. They sat like that for a while, not needing to speak. The mural loomed behind them, bright and unfinished. The air smelled of damp stone and oil paint. A leaf drifted past, golden and crisp, landing between them like a punctuation mark. Eventually, Chloe broke the silence. "You know, I used to sleep in a warehouse. One winter, I painted the inside of the boiler room just to make it feel like less of a cage. It was stupid, probably, but it kept me sane." Julian looked at her, really looked. "I do not think that is stupid at all." Her eyes met his, unguarded for once. Something flickered in the space between them. Not desire, not yet, but something more dangerous, understanding. It did not feel like surrender. It felt like something quieter. Like two people who had stopped hiding from themselves, even if just for a moment. The following days unfolded with a gentler rhythm, as if the garden itself sensed the truce settling between them. The air turned cooler, the shadows longer, but there was warmth in the quiet moments they shared. An easy kind of stillness that no longer needed to be filled with sarcasm or sharp glances. One morning, Chloe arrived to find Julian already in the garden, crouched beside a flower bed with his sleeves pushed up, digging quietly into the soil with a small spade. She blinked, surprised. You garden now? He glanced up, smudged with earth and entirely unbothered. Apparently, it is more peaceful than arguing with board members about projections I do not believe in. She chuckled, setting down her satchel. Careful, you sound dangerously human. He did not respond immediately, just looked at her with a kind of reluctant amusement that had become more familiar lately. I think I am discovering that. They began to fall into a rhythm not dictated by schedules or necessity. Chloe would paint while Julian read nearby, or took calls with his voice softened, no longer performing for anyone but himself. He started bringing her coffee, never asking how she liked it, but somehow getting it right after the third attempt. She brought snacks once, small pastries wrapped in parchment paper, leaving them on the bench without a word. They disappeared within the hour. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they did not. But the silence between them had changed. It had grown companionable, threaded with something tentative and fragile, something that neither of them dared to name. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops, Julian leaned against the garden wall while Chloe painted the final edge of the phoenix wing. Her fingers were stained with cobalt blue, and a smudge of charcoal marked the edge of her jaw. You never explained the fire, he said quietly. She kept painting. It is not destruction, not here. Then what is it? She paused, stepping down from the ladder. It is rebirth. That is what the phoenix is for. Julian studied her face, her eyes catching the last of the amber light. And you believe in that? Rebirth? I have to, she said simply. Otherwise, what is the point of surviving? He looked at her then, more fully than he had before, not as an interruption or an anomaly, but as someone who had built her strength from the ruins of her own struggle, someone whose flame had not consumed her, but refined her. A breeze passed through the garden, stirring fallen leaves. Chloe brushed a strand of hair from her cheek and caught him staring. What? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Julian shook his head, almost smiling. Nothing, just wondering how we got here. She laughed, light and quick. Blame the cookie. His smile deepened. It was a rare thing, without calculation or polish, pure, brief, and in that fleeting moment, between laughter and fading light, something passed between them. Not spoken aloud, not acknowledged, but there nonetheless. A spark, small, undeniable, and quietly dangerous. They both looked away, as if afraid that meeting eyes again might give it shape, but neither of them moved, neither of them left. And that somehow said more than words ever could. The garden, now a sanctuary draped in late autumn gold, seemed to close in around them, not in confinement but in quiet conspiracy. Outside those walls, life moved with urgency. Emails, deadlines, voices demanding things. But within, time softened. They began to occupy each other's space without asking, without apology. It became habit, and then something more. Julian noticed the sketchbook one afternoon when Chloe had stepped away to take a call. It sat open on the bench, half shadowed by a falling leaf. He had not meant to look, but his eyes caught the familiar angle of a jawline, the lift of a shoulder, rendered in charcoal, spare and elegant. It was him. She had drawn him sitting just like that, spine straight but face tilted upward, as if listening to something no one else could hear. When Chloe returned, he had already looked away, pretending to be absorbed in the newspaper spread across his lap. She said nothing about the sketchbook, and neither did he, but something subtle curled through his chest, warm and disarming. Later that week, she found her coffee waiting on the stone table, lid already marked with her usual order. No note, no explanation. She glanced toward the house. The terrace doors were open, curtains fluttering, but Julian was not visible. Still, she smiled as she took the first sip. He always got the cinnamon ratio wrong, just slightly too much, but she drank it anyway. They grew fluent in small, unspoken gestures. A folded blanket left when the wind turned cold. A book lent and returned without a word. A scarf Chloe forgot on the bench, and Julian draped over the railing where she would find it the next morning. These were not declarations. They were choices, deliberate, quiet decisions to remain within each other's gravity. And yet the world beyond the garden kept knocking. Julian's phone buzzed more frequently now, his voice sharper during calls. Names Chloe did not recognize floated through the air. Investors, board meetings, phrases like quarterly restructuring and public optics. Once she saw a woman's name flash across his screen while he was making tea inside. He answered with that smooth, clipped tone he never used with Chloe. the one she remembered from their first meeting, the one she had never liked. She told herself it was none of her business. But that night, she stayed longer than usual, sitting by the mural long after the sky had gone dark, her brush idle in her hand. Julian joined her in silence, holding out a cup of tea. Chamomile, he said. Thought you might need something without caffeine. She took it, fingers brushing his. You remembered. I remember everything that matters. The words hovered for a moment, too tender to ignore, too dangerous to touch. Chloe looked down at the steam curling from the cup, then at the phoenix on the wall, finished now, its wings wide, its body glowing against the twilight. We cannot stay here forever, she said softly. Julian nodded. I know, but neither of them moved. Not yet, because some moments are meant to stretch just a little longer before the world claims them again. It began with a glance. One of those sharp, fleeting looks across a room that says more than it should. Chloe noticed it at a gallery event she had been invited to by Julian's sister, who had insisted she come just to see how the art world breathes when it's wearing heels and a mask. Chloe had arrived late, still smelling faintly of turpentine and autumn air, her dress thrifted and her lipstick imperfect. She had barely stepped into the marble-floored gallery before the eyes found her. They were polite at first, curious, but beneath that curiosity was something cooler, more calculated. She felt it when people lingered too long in conversation with Julian, then flicked their gaze toward her and smiled a little too tightly. She heard it in the way women pronounced the word artist, as if it were a euphemism for someone who had wandered too far outside the velvet rope. And Julian, ever composed, ever smooth, seemed unaware or unwilling to acknowledge it. But his mother noticed. Eleanor Hayes had the kind of presence that silenced a room just by stepping into it. That night she wore a dress the color of polished obsidian and diamonds that caught the light like a blade. She moved through the crowd like a curator through her private collection, nodding with gentle authority, speaking in a tone that made others lean closer. Julian had just finished introducing Chloe to a renowned sculptor when Eleanor approached, her smile fixed and her eyes calculating. I see you brought company, she said, her voice silk over steel. Chloe turned to face her fully, not smiling, not flinching. Julian cleared his throat. Mother, this is Chloe Evans. She's the artist who completed the mural at the house. Eleanor's smile did not falter, but her gaze flicked, once quickly, from Chloe's boots to her fingernails to the small smudge of graphite on her wrist. How unconventional, she said. A pleasure, Miss Evans. I must say, you've certainly left an impression. Chloe met her eyes without blinking. That's the job. A tense beat passed. Eleanor's lips curved slightly, like a cat recognizing a mouse that might bite back. Well, Julian has always had an eye for interesting projects. Later, as the crowd thinned and the wine ran dry, Chloe stood near the window, watching the city flicker beneath them. Julian approached, his hand brushing hers. She does not like me, Chloe said quietly without accusation. She does not know you, he replied just as soft. She does not want to. Julian sighed, his jaw tight. She believes in maintaining the family image. She spent a lifetime building it. And I do not fit, Chloe said, not a question. He hesitated. You challenge it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavier than it had ever been in the garden. Chloe stared at her own reflection in the glass, half shadowed, half lost. You do not have to protect me from her, she said. Just do not pretend this is not happening. Julian looked at her then, and for the first time she saw something close to fear behind his eyes. Not of her, but of what it might cost to keep her. The world outside the garden had found them, and it had teeth. The following morning the rain came, slow at first, tapping lightly against the windows of Julian's townhouse. Then heavier, a steady drumbeat that turned the garden into a glistening mosaic of wet stone and dying leaves. Chloe did not come that day. She had sent a message, short, polite, impersonal, saying the weather made it impossible to work. Julian stood by the terrace door with his phone in hand long after the screen had gone dark. Inside, the walls of his world felt tighter. Eleanor Hayes chose her moment with precision. Over breakfast, while the silver teapot still steamed and the morning paper lay unread, she set her cup down with a sound that was barely audible but unmistakably final. I spoke with Olivia, she began, eyes never leaving the rim of her porcelain. Julian glanced up, already bracing himself. And what does my ex-girlfriend have to say these days? She is concerned for you. Is that what she told you or what you decided for her? Eleanor folded her hands. Do not be flippant, Julian. You know as well as I do how quickly the world you've built can unravel, especially when emotion clouds your judgment. He leaned back in his chair, the same composed expression he always wore in boardrooms sliding into place. You think Chloe is a threat. I think she is not one of us. She is not a thief. She is not a future. The silence that followed was taut and cold. Julian's voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. You do not know her. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a printed article, tabloid, glossy, and smudged with the residue of gossip. Across the front page was a photo of Chloe exiting a building in Soho, a paint-smeared hoodie tied around her waist, her face caught mid-expression. The headline beneath was as cruel as it was shallow. From street walls to penthouse halls. Who is Julian Hayes's latest muse? She will not survive this, Eleanor said, sliding the paper toward him. And neither will you. Not in the way you've been trained to. He said nothing. Just stared at the page, at Chloe's face framed by flashbulbs and speculation. That same afternoon, Olivia reappeared like smoke in a locked room. She arrived under the guise of civility, dropping by the office, offering a soft smile, her hair swept up the way Julian once liked. She laughed at things he no longer found amusing. She remembered his coffee order and delivered it without asking. She spoke in a voice that sounded like comfort, but moved like a knife. She's clever, Olivia said over lunch, as if discussing a promising intern. A little rough around the edges, but that's charming, for now. Julian did not respond. Olivia's smile widened. You know how this works, Julian. They rise or they burn. And people like her, they burn. That night, Chloe stood beneath the overhang of her building, her hoodie soaked through and her hair curling damply against her cheeks. Her phone buzzed with messages, some kind, most not. Her name was trending. The mural had gone viral, but so had her connection to Julian. Strangers speculated. Some mocked. Others called her lucky. She felt none of those things. Julian called once. She let it ring. Not because she wanted distance, but because she feared what might be waiting at the other end of his silence. And for the first time since that ridiculous cookie, something between them truly cracked. Not from anger, but from the weight of too many eyes, too many whispers, and a world that had never been kind to girls who painted their hope on public walls. The days blurred, edged with tension neither of them knew how to name. The garden, once a space of warmth and color, now sat quiet, stripped of its laughter, its quiet rhythm. The mural remained, vibrant and full of movement, but Chloe no longer stayed to admire it. She arrived, touched up fading lines, repainted chipped corners, and left before Julian came out. Sometimes he watched from the window, but never approached. Sometimes he did not watch at all. The air between them had shifted again, only this time it was not making space for something tender. It was pulling back, making room for doubt. Online, her name appeared more frequently, threads speculating whether she had been a calculated distraction or an opportunist with paint-stained fingers. Some called her brilliant, others used sharper words. There were headlines about class, about scandal, about how the street girl had risen too far, too fast. She stopped checking her phone. At a gallery opening downtown, Chloe overheard two women in silk dresses whispering near the wine table. Did you see her interview in that blog? The one where she said she never finished college? She says authentic. They hear unpolished. Honestly, I'd give it a month. They laughed softly, the kind of laugh that bites while smiling. Chloe did not stay long. Meanwhile, Julian moved through his world with careful steps and heavy silence. Meetings grew longer, reporters circled closer. His company's board raised discreet concerns. Nothing overt, nothing in writing, but the meaning behind their words was clear. Control the story, or let the story control you. He wanted to defend her, to stand beside her in the storm. But every time he opened his mouth, something invisible caught in his throat. An old habit, perhaps, bred from a lifetime of tailoring himself to fit the frame others expected of him. And Chloe felt it, not just in the silence, but in the absence. He no longer brought her coffee, no longer asked about the mural or her newest sketches. When he spoke, his words were careful, too careful, as though anything honest might be used against him later. They argued once, late at night, in the garden, where only the moon was witness. Chloe, raw and trembling, asked him if he was ashamed. Julian, exhausted and guarded, said she was being unfair. It is not about shame, he said. It is about consequences. And I am the consequence, she replied, her voice low. He reached for her hand, but she stepped back before he could touch her. She left without another word. After that night, the trust between them, fragile, newly built, began to tremble under its own weight. Not because of what had been said, but because of everything left unsaid. And as autumn deepened and the cold found its way into every corner of the city, they each returned to their separate silences, unsure if the distance between them was still something they could cross, or if they had already let go. The story broke on a Thursday morning. It began with a photograph, blurry, almost careless, taken through the tinted glass of a black car. Julian in the back seat, Olivia beside him, her hand resting lightly on his knee, a headline wrapped around the image like a noose. Power couple reunited? Hayes and Sinclair spotted together amid rumors of reconciliation. The article was worse. It cited anonymous sources, referenced a mutual understanding, suggested Chloe had always been a temporary distraction, a phase Julian had indulged before returning to someone more appropriate. By the time Chloe saw it, the article had already been shared thousands of times. She stared at the screen for a long moment, the blood draining from her face. The worst part was not the photograph. It was the silence that followed. Julian had not called, had not messaged, had said nothing. The hurt came like a slow flood, rising inch by inch until it stole her breath. She tried to tell herself it was a mistake, a fabrication, but the image, Julian seated next to Olivia, not recoiling, not moving, burned through all her reasoning. She waited a day, then another. On the third, she walked into the garden with her sketchbook clutched to her chest, the mural behind her faded by weeks of weather and neglect. Julian was already there, leaning against the far end of the wall, his suit wrinkled, his face shadowed with sleeplessness. He straightened when he saw her. "Chloe," he said, stepping forward. "You could have told me," she said, voice steady, eyes unreadable. "It is not what it looks like." "Then what is it?" He hesitated, a pause small, fatal. "She reached out," he said. "It was about business. She took the opportunity to spin it. I should have shut it down harder." "You did not," Chloe said, barely above a whisper. Julian opened his mouth, but no explanation came. "You let it grow," she said, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "You let the world write their version of us because it was safer." "That is not true." "It is not false either." She stepped back, breath trembling. "I could have handled the noise. I could have handled the pressure, the comments, your mother. But not this. Not being made into a mistake you were too polite to correct." Julian took another step, but she was already turning away. "Chloe, please." She stopped, hand on the iron gate. "I loved you," she said quietly. "I thought you knew that." Then she walked out, leaving behind the unfinished mural, the memory of teacups and silent glances, and the man who had once made her believe the world could bend towards something real. Julian stood in the echo of her absence, surrounded by everything they had not said and knew, with a cold, hollow certainty that he had broken something no apology could easily mend. The city did not pause for heartbreak. Chloe returned to her apartment in Brooklyn, the one with creaking floorboards and sunlight that filtered through sheer curtains like watercolor. It was small and imperfect, and hers. She unpacked her brushes slowly, as if relearning the feel of them, and stacked her sketchbooks in a corner without opening them. For days she did not paint. She walked, rode the subway, spent long hours at the edge of the river, where the wind smelled of iron and the sky stretched like an empty canvas, waiting for a braver hand. But silence had never been her home. So when a community center downtown asked if she would teach a free weekend art class, she said yes. The children came with ink on their fingers and chaos in their voices. They spilled stories into paper and color. Some painted monsters with too many teeth. Others traced outlines of broken houses and girls with wings. Chloe never asked what anything meant. She only nodded, offered more paint, and made sure no one left without signing their name in the corner. She spoke little of Julian. When friends asked, she smiled without answering. But her art changed. The lines were darker now, the wings wider, the fire less contained. The phoenix appeared again and again, sometimes fractured, sometimes mid-flight, but never still, never falling. Across the city in his high rise of glass and steel, Julian walked through his life like a ghost wearing a familiar suit. He fulfilled his obligations, attended meetings, returned calls, approved strategies, but his mind wandered, back to the garden, back to her. Her absence was not loud. It was quiet in the way things are when they have been woven into your daily rhythm, like a song you do not realize you are humming until it is gone. The coffee he made each morning tasted different now, though the process had not changed. The garden was quiet, too. The mural still watched him, vibrant and defiant, like a voice preserved in color. He tried reaching out once, a message left unread. Olivia, sensing the shift, retreated with practiced grace. His mother stopped mentioning Chloe's name, not out of kindness, but out of discomfort, as if the silence was cleaner than the truth of what had been lost. Some nights Julian sat in the garden alone, coat draped over his shoulders, fingers wrapped around a cup he no longer drank from. He would stare at the wall, at the phoenix, and wonder if it had always been looking past him. Chloe never stopped creating, but she no longer painted for escape or to prove anything. She painted to survive, to stay open, to remember. Julian, meanwhile, realized that success, without something honest anchoring it, was nothing but weight. And with each passing day, that weight pressed heavier on his chest until he could no longer pretend he was whole. They were both alone, but differently now. She had walked away to save herself, and he had let her go because he did not yet know how to fight for anything that could not be measured, bought, or repaired with a deal. But the ache that remained in both of them was the same. And somewhere beneath it, buried deep and stubborn, was the quiet, pulsing truth that what they had found, brief, imperfect, real, was not yet finished. Julian found her in the garden one cold morning, his sister bundled in a knit sweater far too large for her, and sipping tea with both hands wrapped around the cup. The mural stretched behind her, muted now in winter light, but still alive in a way that made everything else around it seem quieter. She looked up as he stepped onto the terrace, his posture rigid, the collar of his coat turned up against the wind. "I thought you had meetings," she said gently. "I canceled them," Julian replied. That surprised her. He never canceled anything. He sat down beside her on the stone bench, their breath visible between them in the chill. For a while neither spoke. The silence was companionable until he broke it with a question he had never asked aloud, not even to himself. "Did you ever want to disappear?" His sister blinked, but she did not laugh. She knew that voice. She had once spoken with it, years ago, when the pressure of perfection had nearly undone her. "All the time," she said. Julian stared at his gloved hands, the same hands that had signed contracts, closed deals, shaken palms that meant empires. Now they looked like they belonged to someone else. "I do not know what I am doing anymore," he said. "I used to be so certain about what mattered, about how to be effective, strategic, impressive. And now I wake up and everything I used to chase feels hollow." His sister studied him, her voice soft but unwavering. "Because it is. If you are always running toward the version of yourself everyone wants, you never stop to ask who you actually are." He let out a long breath, white against the gray morning. "I let her walk away." "She was not walking away from you," she said carefully. "She was walking away from a world that never made space for her." Julian closed his eyes. "But I was part of that world. I defended it. I let the narrative twist because I was too afraid to challenge it." His sister reached over, rested her hand on his. "You were not afraid of them. You were afraid of what it would mean to choose something they did not approve of." Julian turned to her, the wind tugging gently at his hair. "Have you ever regretted it, walking away from what they wanted?" She smiled, but it was not a smile of ease. "Every day, and never once." He nodded, the words sinking deeper than they should have. Deeper than he had let anything sink in years. She stood after a moment, dusting snowflakes from her sleeves. "You loved her." "I still do," he said. "Then what are you waiting for?" Julian sat alone long after she had gone, staring at the mural Chloe had left behind. He looked at the fire in the phoenix's wings, at the lines carved with such care. For the first time, he saw it not just as a symbol of rebirth, but as a map, of loss, of return, of courage. He had built his life to withstand storms, but never questioned whether the structure itself was worth preserving. Now he was ready to dismantle it, not for her, for the version of himself that had died somewhere along the way and deserved to live again. The first place he went was not her apartment or the gallery or the garden. It was a wall in the Lower East Side, faded now, chipped from time and weather, but still bold in its defiance. A girl with her head thrown back, eyes closed, mouth open in a silent scream that seemed to echo off the bricks. Chloe had painted it years ago. He recognized the line work, the color palette, the fury disguised as grace. Julian stood in front of it for a long while, hands buried in his coat pockets, his breath shallow against the winter air. No one paid him much attention, just another man in a suit trying to understand something he had once walked past. From there he found more. A mural behind a laundromat in Bushwick, children reaching for stars drawn in chalk. A crumbling stairwell in Harlem turned into a mosaic of laughter and movement. Chloe's name was never signed, not fully, just a small C in the corner. But it was enough. She had left pieces of herself all over the city. He had just never learned how to see them before. He showed up at the community center unannounced. The woman at the front desk looked up from her clipboard and blinked. "Are you here for donations or?" "I am here to volunteer," Julian said, his voice steady. The woman raised an eyebrow, but handed him a form. By the next day, he was hauling crates of supplies, setting up easels, and helping kids mix color without staining every inch of their clothes. He did not mention Chloe. He did not ask about her, but he listened. And in listening, he began to understand. He met a boy who had not spoken for weeks but painted dragons with eyes full of sadness. A girl who drew maps, of neighborhoods, of imaginary cities, of escape routes no one else could see. Julian sat beside them, handing out brushes, refilling water jars, learning that quiet could be a kind of offering, not a withdrawal. When Chloe finally saw him, it was not dramatic. She walked into the center late on a rainy afternoon, umbrella dripping, hair plastered to her forehead. She had come to deliver more paints, not expecting anything but the usual chaos and noise. And there he was, on his knees beside a plastic table, sleeves rolled up, teaching a 6-year-old how to blend shades of green without turning them to mud. He looked up as she entered. Their eyes met. He stood slowly, uncertain if she would stay. She did not move. She said nothing. The child tugged at Julian's sleeve. "Mr. J, look, I made a forest." Julian smiled, still looking at her. "It is beautiful," he said. "Keep going." The boy turned back to his work. Julian walked over, stopping just a few steps away from her. "I am not here to fix anything," he said quietly. "I am here because I was wrong. About what mattered. About you. About myself." Chloe stared at him, drenched, exhausted, her voice quiet. "Why now?" "Because I finally stopped being afraid of who I am when I am not trying to impress anyone." She looked down, fingers tightening around the handle of her umbrella. "You cannot undo what already hurt," she said. "I know, but I can be better than the man who caused it." Outside, the rain thickened, falling in sheets. But inside, between old walls covered in crayon drawings and paper suns, something softened. Not forgiveness, not yet, but space. He had come into her world, not to claim it, but to kneel inside it. Not to offer redemption, but to earn presence. And she, guarded, fierce, still healing, allowed him to stay. It began with an email, discreetly sent to curators, collectors, critics who mattered, and a list of names that for once did not include his mother. The venue was an old train station repurposed into a gallery space. All raw brick and vaulted ceilings, industrial bones softened by hanging lights and reclaimed wood. It was not glamorous in the traditional sense, but it had soul. Julian chose it because Chloe had once said that walls with stories made better canvases. The event was billed simply, Voices in Color, a study of urban truths. Chloe's name was not headlined. Not until you walked in and saw it, etched in light at the far end of the space, floating above a massive centerpiece mural she had completed in secret over the course of several sleepless nights. It was a cityscape fractured by vines, rising from cracked streets and bursting through windows, nature reclaiming steel, grief woven into hope, anger softened by possibility. She had almost said no when Julian told her. She had nearly walked away from the idea, the way she had walked away from him. But something in his eyes, steady, clear, stripped of agenda, convinced her to listen. He had not tried to talk her into it. He had simply made space. Now the room hummed with voices and soft footsteps. People stood in front of her work, not scrolling their phones or murmuring about trends, but pausing, staring, absorbing. She had not been part of a show like this before. Not one where her name was written on the wall in equal size beside artists who had sold pieces for millions. And she had never seen Julian look the way he did now. Not like a man who owned the room, but like a man who had finally laid something down. When he stepped onto the low wooden platform at the center, the room fell into a hush. He wore no tie, no perfectly tailored armor, just a black shirt, sleeves rolled, hands relaxed at his sides. His voice when he spoke was calm, not performative, not polished, honest. Tonight is not about commerce, he said, and it is not about me. He glanced toward Chloe, where she stood off to the side, half shadowed by a steel beam, arms crossed over her chest as if trying to contain the tremble beneath her ribs. This is about voices we forget to hear, about stories told without permission, about the kind of art that does not beg to be framed, but demands to be felt. He looked out across the crowd, past the blinking cameras and polite nods, past the moneyed men and sharply dressed women, and finally he turned toward the only person in the room whose gaze mattered. There was a time I measured everything by success, by market value, by approval, by applause. But then I met someone who paints not because it will be bought, but because it refuses to be silenced. He stepped down, walked slowly across the floor, not stopping until he stood in front of her. In a world full of noise, you are the truth. Not because it is easy, but because it is yours. Chloe's fingers twitched at her sides. You did not have to do this, she whispered. I know, he said. That is why I did. Behind them, the crowd erupted in applause. But in that moment, neither of them heard it. Because love, real love, does not always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it is simply a man choosing to step aside, to lift someone else's voice, and to mean it. And Chloe, for the first time in months, let herself believe he truly did. The last guest trickled out as the evening deepened into quiet. The gallery had dimmed, leaving only pools of amber light drifting across the floor like low fog. The mural still held its glow, even as shadows lengthened along its edges. Chloe stood a few feet back from it, arms folded loosely, her gaze distant. Not admiring, not critiquing, just breathing it in. It felt less like a conclusion than a beginning. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Julian stopped beside her, not too close. The silence between them was no longer cold. It had shifted again, into something gentle, something waiting. He did not speak, he did not need to. Chloe turned to him, eyes searching, the weight of everything unsaid flickering behind them. He held out his hand. No speech, no grand promises, just the simple offering of presence, of a choice freely made. She looked at it for a moment, then took it. His fingers closed around hers with quiet certainty, like something returned, not claimed. They did not kiss. They did not declare anything to the room now empty of witnesses. Instead, they walked through the gallery side by side, through the soft hush of their own second chance. In the weeks that followed, Julian spent more time in Chloe's world than his own. He helped prime blank walls, hauled ladders, carried paint cans across rooftops and alleyways. She teased him when he smudged the wrong colors, rolled her eyes when he asked too many questions, but she taught him, patiently, fiercely. Their first mural together was in a neglected courtyard behind a library that had once been a factory. Children watched from the windows while they painted. Julian filled in backgrounds, large swaths of sky, waves of light. Chloe worked beside him, drawing out details, coaxing life into shapes with the precision of someone who had never forgotten what it meant to be overlooked. The mural rose slowly, day by day, a tree stretching out of fractured pavement, its roots tangled in books and memory, its branches reaching beyond the walls. A small phoenix nested near the top. They signed it together, just their initials, C&J, no headlines, no announcements. When they finished, they stood back, arms paint-streaked, wind in their hair. Chloe turned to him, a faint smile playing at her lips. Not bad, she said. Julian leaned closer, brushing a streak of red from her cheek with his thumb. You made it beautiful. She looked at him then, fully, without hesitation. We did. Their story, like the mural, did not begin in clarity. It had cracked and burned and been rebuilt from raw pieces. But it stood now, unfinished, evolving, defiantly theirs. And love, like art, had finally found where it belonged.